My lungs burned as I tried to pull in air, every breath jagged, every second heavier than the last. I could feel the sharp sting spreading across my ribs and the searing ache in my stomach where his boot had just driven me into the marble floor. The world, tilted lights above me blurred, and I tasted blood at the corner of my mouth. My stepbrother Dylan stood over me, face twisted in fury, his eyes wild, his boot still pressing dangerously close as if daring me to move. I had faced training drills at Fort Hood that pushed me to the edge of collapse, but nothing compared to the humiliation of lying on the floor of my grandfather's mansion with my own family turning into enemies. Behind him, my father's voice roared through the grand hall filled with rage and entitlement. "Sign it over or you are nothing!" The words cracked like gunfire, each syllable heavier than the boot in my stomach. His face was red veins bulging on his neck, his fists clenched at his sides, ready to strike again if I resisted. I wanted to fight back, every fiber of the soldier in me screaming to rise, but the pain pinned me down. In that moment, I was not a trained specialist of the United States Army. I was a 19-year-old girl cornered by the people who were supposed to love me. I could not comprehend how far greed could drag them, how much darkness money could unleash. $7 billion. That number had already destroyed every trace of family I thought I had. The marble floor beneath me was cold and unforgiving. I tried to push myself up my hand, slipping in the smear of blood from my split lip. Dylan sneered down at me and hissed through clenched teeth. "You will crawl before this is over." My chest tightened, panic pressing against discipline. At Fort Hood, I had been taught to focus under pressure to find clarity in chaos. But here, there were no drill sergeants, no comrades at my side, only the echo of betrayal in the place I had once called sanctuary. My mind screamed with questions. How did it come to this? How did I end up gasping for air while the people who shared my blood treated me like an obstacle to be crushed? The boot, the blood, the command to surrender, everything, all of it crashed into one truth. They no longer saw me as their daughter or sister. I was a wall between them and their fortune, and walls could be broken. The chandelier above swayed gently, as if mocking my struggle, the crystals scattering light across the room, each sparkle reflecting how fragile my hold on this moment was. Pain clawed at my insides, but shame hurt worse. The shame of realizing my family would rather see me broken than see me stand as the rightful heir of my grandfather's legacy. And yet, even lying on that floor vision swimming, I knew one thing. This story was not going to end with me silent and crushed. If you have ever watched money tear apart the people who are supposed to stand beside you, if you have ever seen a family choose greed over love, then you will understand why I had to fight. Comment below if you have lived through that kind of betrayal. Because tonight, with a boot in my stomach and my father's voice threatening to erase me, I learned the cost of saying no. And this was only the beginning. The first light of dawn at Fort Hood always arrived with a chill that slipped through my uniform and bit at my skin, a reminder that discipline started before the sun rose. At 19, I was still adjusting to the rhythm of military life, but there was something grounding about the sound of boots hitting pavement in unison, the steady cadence of voices calling out numbers as we pushed through each run. Sweat poured down my temples and soaked into my shirt, yet I felt a strange pride each time I forced my body to keep pace. In those moments, I was not invisible. I was not the overlooked daughter or the unwanted stepchild. I was Specialist Hannah Walker, a soldier with a purpose. After morning PT, I would clean my rifle until every piece gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the barracks. Some of the others teased me for being meticulous, but I did not care. It gave me focus. In the Army, there was no room for carelessness, and every task mattered. The repetition built strength not just in my arms, but in my mind. I found comfort in the predictability in the order that stood in such sharp contrast to the chaos of my home life. Even the simplest things felt like victories. Finishing a run without falling behind, hearing my name called during roll, eating a hot meal in the mess hall after a long day of drills. They were small, ordinary details, but they reminded me I belonged to something bigger than myself. The friendships I built there were different, too. We joked in the barracks, complained about the food-shared stories from back home. But when the alarm sounded or the drill sergeant barked, we moved as one. That bond was real, forged through sweat and exhaustion. I knew that if I stumbled, someone would pull me up. That kind of loyalty had no equivalent in my family back in Dallas. In the Army, worth was measured by commitment and resilience. At home, worth was measured in dollars clothes and who you knew at the country club. The difference was suffocating. Sometimes at night, lying in my bunk with the faint hum of air conditioning and the quiet snores of other soldiers around me, I thought about how little my family knew about this world. They never asked about my training, never cared about my progress. To them, my uniform was a costume something beneath the standards of their social circles. But to me, it was armor. Armor against their voices, armor against their contempt. It gave me dignity, the kind my father never offered, the kind my stepmother never understood, the kind my stepbrother never valued. Back in Dallas, the air always felt heavier, not because of the weather, but because of the atmosphere inside that house. My father, Richard Carter, carried himself like a man who thought the world owed him respect. Yet most of his achievements came not from his own effort, but from clinging to the name and wealth of his father. He thrived on control. Every word from his mouth was a command disguised as advice, every glance a reminder that I would never meet his standards. He dismissed my choice to enlist as reckless, calling it a distraction from what he believed real success should look like. To him, success meant corner offices, designer suits, and the ability to intimidate others into submission. I knew from a young age that I was never going to fit into the mold he wanted for his family. My stepmother Diane was no better. She invested every ounce of her energy into appearances. She lived for cocktail parties, whispered gossip in the polished halls of Dallas country clubs, and the glint of jewelry under chandelier lights. She looked at me as if I were a stain on her carefully curated image, a reminder that my existence did not align with the lifestyle she craved. Every holiday became an exhibition of status, every dinner table a runway for her perfection. If I mentioned my training, my bunkmates, or even the discipline I was learning, her lips tightened as if I had spoken in a foreign language. To her, I was less than the expensive bags hanging in her closet. Dylan, my stepbrother, absorbed their values like a sponge, but twisted them into something even darker. At 24, he had burned through opportunities, loans, and goodwill. He had a talent for charming people long enough to drain them, and when charm failed, he resorted to threats. He saw himself as invincible because my father always covered for him. Every reckless decision was excused as youth, every failure brushed away with money. He sneered at my uniform, called me the family charity case, and laughed when I told him about early mornings on the track at Fort Hood. To Dylan, I was entertainment, a punching bag for his sarcasm and disdain. In that household, there was no warmth, no acknowledgement of my small victories. Every time I came home from base, I braced myself not for questions about my well-being, but for criticism. Why did I look so tired? Why did I waste time in the military instead of networking? Why did I not act more like Dylan? I became an outsider in my own family, a stranger tolerated only because my grandfather still cared for me. He was the one person who told me that integrity mattered more than status, that discipline was a strength, not a weakness. But even his presence could not erase the daily sting of being treated as less than nothing by those who should have protected me. Each visit home left me feeling smaller, yet each return to Fort Hood made me stand taller. I learned to channel their rejection into determination. I told myself that one day their arrogance would collapse under its own weight. I just never imagined that collapse would be triggered by $7 billion. The night it happened, I was sitting at my small desk in the barracks, half listening to the low hum of the air conditioning and scratching notes on a training manual when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was just another reminder from the base schedule, but the number on the screen was unfamiliar. Something in me hesitated before answering, and I almost let it ring out. When I pressed the phone to my ear, the voice on the other end was heavy and official. "Miss Walker, this is Officer Daniels with the Texas Highway Patrol." His tone was enough to freeze me in place. I gripped the phone tighter, waiting. "I am sorry to inform you that your grandfather, Harold Walker, was involved in a collision tonight on the Houston freeway. His vehicle was struck by a drunk driver." There was a pause, the kind that feels like the whole world holding its breath. He did not survive. The words fell like a hammer inside my chest. My pen slipped from my hand and rolled onto the floor, and all I could hear was the hollow echo of those words. Did not survive. My grandfather was not supposed to be mortal. He was the one constant, the man whose steady voice had carried me through storms my family created. He was the one who had told me again and again that integrity was worth more than gold. And now an accident senseless and brutal had taken him from me. I could not speak. I barely managed to whisper thank you before the officer ended the call. The silence in the room pressed down on me until my breath came in shallow bursts. My hands trembled, and I pressed my palms against my uniform pants as if I could stop the shaking. Images rushed through my head. My grandfather's smile when I showed him my first set of orders, his laugh echoing in the garden behind his mansion, the way he leaned over the piano when I tried to play, even though I was never very good. He always said the music was not in the notes, but in the heart. And now he was gone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, unable to accept what I had just heard. Soldiers are trained to process loss, to keep moving forward, but nothing in my training had prepared me for this. He was not just family, he was my only anchor in a life that felt designed to push me out. The day of the funeral, the sky over Houston hung low and gray, the kind of weather that presses down on you like an extra weight you cannot shrug off. I stood in formation with myself, shoulders square in my uniform boots polished to a shine, trying to carry my grief with the same discipline I carried my rifle at Fort Hood. The rows of black suits and dark dresses stretched across the lawn, but most of the faces blurred together. People who had not visited my grandfather in years, now suddenly appearing for the spectacle. My family arrived late. Richard in his tailored suit with his jaw set tight, Diane adjusting her pearl necklace for the photographers, and Dylan with sunglasses covering his eyes, though there was no sun. Their voices carried whispers about assets and bank accounts, even as the casket rested only a few feet away. I felt anger twist inside me, but swallowed it because this was not their day. This was my grandfather's. As the service began, I focused on the flag draped across the casket. My chest ached with pride and sorrow at once, because I knew that beneath that flag was not just a billionaire, but the only person who had ever truly believed in me. The minister spoke words of comfort, but they fell flat against the restless movements of my father and stepmother. They scolded the funeral director about flowers, argued over the quality of the catering, and kept looking around to see who was watching them. Dylan leaned against a marble column at the edge of the cemetery, scrolling through his phone, sighing, as though the ceremony was an inconvenience. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream at them to demand they show a fragment of respect. But instead, I stayed still because I knew my grandfather would have expected me to carry myself with dignity. When the time came to step forward, I approached the casket alone. My boots crunched softly on the gravel, each step echoing in my head. I placed my hand lightly on the wood, cool beneath my fingers, and whispered so low only I could hear. I promise to make you proud. I will not let them tarnish what you built. Behind me, I heard the murmur of relatives posing for sympathy, their tears drying the moment the cameras clicked off. My father's eyes scanned the crowd, calculating, not grieving. My mother's lips tightened as if the entire service was a social burden. I was the only one who stood there with tears running down my face, not for the fortune he left behind, but for the man himself. As the casket was lowered, I raised my hand in a salute, a soldier's gesture, crisp and unwavering. For a moment, everything else fell away, and it was just me and him, my final act of respect. But as I lowered my hand and turned back toward the crowd, reality settled like ice in my stomach. They were already circling, already speaking of inheritances and control. The battle over his legacy had only just begun. After the final prayer ended and the casket disappeared into the earth, the solemn quiet that should have lingered shattered almost instantly. People shifted from whispers of condolence to louder conversations, as if grief could be folded away like the programs handed out at the gate. I lingered near the grave, unwilling to leave my eyes locked on the freshly turned soil. That was when my father's voice cut through the air, sharp and impatient, berating the funeral director about the floral arrangements. He said the roses were too common, that Harold Walker's farewell deserved more exotic blooms, as if the worth of a man could be measured by the rarity of petals. The director, already pale with nerves, apologized repeatedly, but Richard brushed him off with a wave of his hand and turned back to Diane. She nodded in agreement, her pearls glinting as she leaned close to him, her voice dripping with disdain. "Can you believe he drove himself? A billionaire acting like an ordinary man." She laughed softly, as if it were a flaw to value simplicity. My chest tightened. That simple black sedan had carried me and my grandfather through countless afternoons, driving out to small diners where he insisted the pie tasted better than at any five-star restaurant. To them, the car was a blemish on status. To me, it was memory. Dylan slouched a few feet away, his suit jacket undone, muttering to a cousin about how long the will would take to read. He smirked when he said it, as though the death of our grandfather was nothing but a pause in his plans for capital. I caught his eye, and he grinned, a cruel glint flashing across his face, mouthing the words, "Soon mine." My stomach turned. Around us, distant relatives cried loudly for the cameras dabbing at their faces with tissues, yet I had not seen any of them at the house in years. Their tears felt like a performance polished for the photographs dried up as soon as the lenses turned away. I felt like I was surrounded by actors on a stage, each one playing a role, none of them real. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I walked away from the crowd and found a quiet corner near the oak trees that lined the cemetery. I needed air, needed to separate myself from the greed that buzzed louder than the cicadas in the branches above. My grandfather had always believed in living quietly, dressing in suits, older than me, never flaunting wealth. He had told me wealth was a tool, not an identity. Now, watching my family circle like vultures, I realized just how deeply he had known them. They had spent his life feeding on his name, and now they were circling his death to feed on what was left. My father approached me, then his face stiff, his voice low but laced with warning. "Do not get in the way, Hannah. You may wear that uniform, but this family knows how to handle business." His words sliced sharper than any reprimand from a drill sergeant. This was not grief speaking. This was possession and open claim over what was not his. I met his eyes and stood as tall as I could, even though every part of me wanted to crumble. "I will not dishonor him," I said quietly. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned sharply, calling Dylan to follow. Diane trailed behind, muttering about seating charts for the reception. I watched them walk away, their figures sharp against the gray sky, and I felt the gulf between us widen into something unbridgeable. They were my family by blood, but in that moment, standing among the whispers of greed, I knew they had never truly been my family at all. I turned back to the grave one last time, my hand brushing against the folded program. The words "integrity is worth more than gold" still echoed in my mind. I whispered a promise into the cold air, a promise I intended to keep no matter how ugly the coming days would become. They might chase the gold, but I would hold on to the integrity, and that would make all the difference. The drive to Austin the next morning felt longer than it should have, every mile marked by the heaviness of what awaited us. I rode alone in my old sedan, the hum of the engine filling the silence that my thoughts refused to break. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to steady the pounding in my chest. My grandfather's lawyer, Michael Turner, had called the night before, his voice calm but firm. "The will is ready to be read. Your presence is required." His words replayed in my mind with every turn of the road. By the time I pulled up to the old Victorian house that served as his office, my stomach was knotted with dread. The building loomed with dark wood and stained glass windows, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers my father liked to haunt in Dallas. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the brass plaque near the door, and forced myself to breathe. This was not a training drill I could run laps to escape. This was my future, and there was no avoiding it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee. The receptionist gave me a sympathetic smile and gestured toward the hallway. Michael Turner waited at the end, his silver hair perfectly combed, his suit pressed. When he saw me, his expression softened. "Hannah, your grandfather spoke of you often." He was proud. His words pierced through the fog of grief, and I swallowed hard, barely able to reply. "Thank you." Before I could gather myself, the sound of heavy footsteps and loud voices echoed down the hall. My father swept in as though he owned the place, Diane at his side, her heels clicking like gunshots against the hardwood floor. Dylan trailed behind them, sunglasses hiding his bloodshot eyes, though it was barely 9 in the morning. My father adjusted his watch with a sharp snap of his wrist and barked, "Let's get this over with. We all know how this ends." Diane smirked as she brushed past me, her perfume overwhelming, while Dylan collapsed into a chair with careless arrogance. I took my seat near Michael, every muscle in my body tense, bracing for the storm I knew was coming. Michael cleared his throat and gestured toward the long oak table, his voice steady as he opened a thick leather folder. "Harold Walker was of sound mind when he updated his will last year. There is no question of his capacity." My father waved a hand impatiently. "Yes, yes, read it." "We all know he left the estate to me." My pulse thundered in my ears as Michael adjusted his glasses and began to read. Michael's voice was calm, but each word landed with the force of a hammer. "I, Harold Walker, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. To my beloved granddaughter, Hannah Walker, I leave the entirety of my estate, financial assets, real estate investments, and holdings valued at approximately $7 billion. For a heartbeat, the room froze in silence. I stared at Michael, certain I had misheard. $7 billion to me. The air cracked open a moment later. My father shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward with a clatter that echoed against the walls. His face turned crimson, veins bulging on his neck as he shouted, "That is insane! He would never bypass me! I built this family's reputation!" Diane clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her voice sharp with disbelief. $7 billion to a girl who plays soldier. She does not know the first thing about managing money." Dylan ripped off his sunglasses and slammed his palm against the table, his voice dripping with rage. "Where is my cut? I need capital for my new company. He promised me." I could feel their fury closing in like a storm. My hands trembled under the table, but I forced myself to breathe, just like I had during weapons qualification when the rifle jammed. "Focus, do not panic." Michael raised a hand, his voice unwavering. Mr. Walker made this decision intentionally. He stated clearly that his son and daughter-in-law had been provided for during his lifetime. His wish was for his fortune to pass solely to Hannah. My father's eyes burned into me, his fists trembling at his sides. "You manipulated him, did you not?" whispered in his ear while he was old and confused. My throat tightened. No, I did not even know he had rewritten his will. I never asked him for anything. Michael pressed a button on a remote and a screen flickered to life on the wall. Suddenly, my grandfather's face filled the room, recorded in a video message. "If you are watching this, it means I have passed. Richard Diane Dillon. I love you as family, but I can no longer ignore what you have become. Greed has blinded you. You see me as a wallet, not as a man. Hannah is different. She visits because she cares, not because she wants. She will carry my legacy with dignity." My father shouted at the screen, his voice cracking with fury. "This is manipulation." He was not thinking straight. But Michael's tone cut through the chaos. "The will is legally binding. Contesting it will be costly and, given the documentation, nearly impossible." I sat frozen, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind. "She will carry my legacy with dignity." I lifted my chin, forcing the word out steady and firm. "No." The night after the will reading, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Come home at 6. We will settle this as a family." There was no question mark, no sense of request. It was an order. I almost ignored it, but some small part of me still wanted to believe they could calm down, that grief had twisted them into anger and time might soften their edges. So at 6, I drove back to the Dallas house, my stomach tight with dread. The moment I stepped into the living room, I knew this was not a family gathering. The furniture had been rearranged, the sofas pushed aside, leaving the room bare like a boardroom. My father stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. Diane sat stiffly on the chair, her eyes, cold lips pressed into a thin line. Dylan sprawled on the couch, his laptop open, fingers tapping furiously until he saw me and smirked. "Sit." My father commanded, his voice steady but simmering with rage. I obeyed, lowering myself into a chair while my palms dampened with sweat. My father set the glass down and leaned forward. "You know what you need to do. Sign the estate over to me. I will manage it properly. You will receive a generous allowance, 10%. That is more money than you will ever need." My chest tightened. 10%. That was over $700 million. The number itself was staggering, yet the way he said it like I was a child being bribed with candy filled me with shame. My mother cut in smoothly, her voice sweet but dripping with poison. "Enough to buy a mansion, enough to live like a queen. You do not need responsibility. Leave that to your father." Dylan slammed his laptop shut and leaned forward. $700 million is plenty. I need the rest for my company. Grandpa wanted me to succeed. Do not be selfish. The words pierced deeper than any insult I had endured in training. Selfish. I had given everything to honor the one person who believed in me, and now they twisted it into greed. I straightened my shoulders, my voice trembling but firm. Grandpa chose me because I was not like this, because I did not see him as a bank account. My father's face hardened, and he took a step closer, towering over me. "This is not about choice. It is about loyalty. Either you sign or you walk out that door with nothing." The silence stretched in the room until I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second louder than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to lift my chin. "No," I said, my voice quiet but unshaken. The word cut through the air like a blade. Dylan exploded first. He leapt to his feet, his face red with rage, and before I could brace myself, his hand cracked across my cheek. The sting shot through my skin, my head snapping to the side. I tasted blood on my lip. He leaned close, his breath hot with fury. "You think you are better than us because of a uniform? You are nothing." My father's eyes narrowed, and instead of stopping him, he shoved me backward with such force that my shoulder slammed against the edge of the table. Pain radiated down my arm, and I stumbled to the floor. Diane rose, then her shrill voice filling the room. "Ungrateful brat! After everything we have given you, private schools lessons, a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us." I pushed myself up, my vision swimming, and met her glare. "All those things were never for me. They were to make you look good." Dylan sneered, looming over me as if ready to strike again. "Enjoy being rich and alone. You will come crawling back once you realize money cannot hug you at night." But it was my father's voice that pierced deepest, dropping low, steady, and dangerous. "If you walk out of this house without signing Hannah, you are no longer my daughter. Do not come back. Do not call. Do not expect a single ounce of help. You will be dead to us." My throat closed, but I forced the words out, my voice cracking. "I guess I have been dead to you for years. You never saw me. You only saw what you wanted." His face twisted in fury, and he grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the front door. Diane shouted orders like a commander. "Pack a bag. 30 minutes. After that, the locks will be changed." I stumbled down the hall to my childhood bedroom, the walls lined with old recital trophies and fading posters. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into a duffel, grabbed my passport, the quilt my grandmother had sewn, and the photo of me with Grandpa at the piano. Every corner of the room was heavy with ghosts of who I had been, ghosts I knew I could not carry back with me. When I stepped into the hall again, my father was waiting, arms crossed, eyes cold. He opened the door wide and pointed to the night beyond. Out. The air was icy as I stepped onto the porch, my bags heavier than they were. My mother's voice followed me sharp and final. "You will regret this, Hannah. Family is forever." I turned steady despite the tears burning in my eyes. "Then why did you just throw me away?" The door slammed shut, and I stood alone in the dark, a soldier without a home, but not defeated. I stood at the edge of the driveway, clutching the strap of my duffel bag so tightly my knuckles ached. The porch light flickered behind me, casting the house in a harsh glow that made it look less like a home and more like a fortress that had just cast me out. My father's words still echoed in my ears, sharp and final. "You are dead to us." My chest burned with the sting of rejection, but beneath the pain, a new flame flickered. I would not let them break me. I loaded the duffel into the back seat of my old sedan, the same car I had prayed would last through deployments and long drives to Fort Hood. It groaned as I turned the key, the engine coughing before settling into a low rumble. I sat there for a moment, staring at the glowing numbers on the dashboard, my breath fogging the cold air. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key my grandfather had given me last year. He had pressed it into my palm with a quiet smile and a wink. "Someday you might need this, Hannah." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental, but now I understood. This was my lifeline, the key to the mansion in Houston, the one place where his laughter had once filled every room, the only place that felt like safety. I tightened my grip on the key until the metal pressed into my skin, then set it on the passenger seat beside the photograph I had grabbed from my childhood bedroom. In the picture, my grandfather sat beside me at the piano, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. I glanced back at the house one last time, its windows glowing faintly against the night sky. Memories rushed in birthdays where I was ignored, dinners where criticism was the main course, evenings spent in silence, while they praised Dylan for accomplishments he never earned. There was nothing left for me inside those walls. With a deep breath, I shifted into gear and rolled out of the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel like the closing notes of a song I would never play again. The city lights faded quickly behind me as I merged onto the highway. The night stretched wide and endless, the dark road illuminated only by the sweep of my headlights. Dallas receded in the mirror, and with every mile I put between us, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. I was leaving behind the only family I had ever known, but I was driving toward the only family who had ever truly cared. The highway stretched before me like an endless ribbon of darkness, broken only by the sweep of my headlights and the occasional glow of taillights far ahead. The rain began not long after I left Dallas Light at first, then heavier, the drops drumming against the roof in a rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. My wipers squeaked with every pass, fighting to clear a view of the road, but the world outside felt blurred, almost dreamlike. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing my focus on the lines painted across the asphalt. Each mile carried me farther from the rejection I had just endured, but it also pressed me closer to something unknown. My duffel bag sat heavy in the passenger seat, and beside it lay the brass key, gleaming faintly each time headlights from passing trucks flashed through the cabin. I glanced at it often, clinging to the thought that I was not entirely lost. That key meant my grandfather had thought ahead. He had known the storm my family would unleash. He had left me more than an inheritance. He had left me a place where I could stand. Hours passed the road, twisting through patches of open land where the night pressed close, and then through small towns that flickered by in bursts of neon signs and shuttered gas stations. I kept driving, fueled by coffee from a dented thermos and the stubborn determination that had carried me through endless drills at Fort Hood. Somewhere near midnight, the rain eased, leaving behind a mist that hovered low across the fields. By the time the skyline of Houston began to rise in the distance, my body was exhausted, but my spirit refused to break. The iron gates of the Walker estate appeared suddenly at the end of a tree-lined road, tall and unyielding with the family crest etched into the center. My chest tightened as I pulled up the tires, crunching over the gravel. For a moment, I hesitated, staring at the gates. Could I really cross this threshold without him here? Would the mansion feel hollow without his laughter? I reached for the key with trembling fingers and slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, the gates swinging open as if they had been waiting for me. I drove slowly up the winding driveway, the oaks arching overhead, their branches bowing in silent welcome. When the mansion finally came into view, its windows glowed softly against the mist. Not cold, not abandoned, but alive. I parked near the steps and stepped out into the cool air. The scent of wet earth and cedar filled my lungs as I walked to the door key in hand. The lock clicked open and I pushed the door wide. Lemon polish and old wood greeted me, the same smell I remembered from childhood weekends. For the first time all night, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt like I had come home. The echo of my footsteps filled the grand foyer as I stepped inside, each sound bouncing against marble floors and high ceilings that had once made me feel so small as a child. Now the silence was heavier, almost watchful, as if the house itself was aware that everything had changed. I set my duffel down carefully and turned slowly, taking in the chandelier above the staircase that curled toward the upper floors, the framed portraits that lined the walls. I half expected my grandfather to appear at the top of the stairs with his warm smile and gentle voice telling me I was late for dinner. Instead, the air was still the only sound, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock near the study. Miss Hannah. The voice startled me low and familiar. I spun toward the shadows, and there he was. Robert Hayes stepped forward, his uniform as crisp as I remembered, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed. Recognition swept over me, and a wave of relief hit so strong I nearly stumbled. "Robert!" My voice cracked. "You are still here." He gave a small nod, his eyes kind but steady. "Your grandfather asked me to remain. He told me there would come a time when you would need this house more than anyone else." His words caught in my chest, a mix of grief and gratitude pressing against my ribs. "I thought everyone would be gone," I whispered. "I thought I would be alone." Robert shook his head firmly. "Alone is the last thing he intended for you." He led me into the study where a fire already burned in the hearth, crackling warmly against the damp chill I had carried from the drive. I sank into one of the leather chairs, feeling the heat seep into my bones. Robert poured me tea from the set my grandfather had always favored, placing the cup gently on the table before me. He looked at me with quiet determination. Mr. Walker anticipated trouble, Miss Hannah. He left instructions. His words echoed like a warning bell. Trouble. My grandfather had always been 5 steps ahead, and if he had prepared for this, then he must have known exactly what my father and Dylan were capable of. I stared into the fire, the flames blurring as tears filled my eyes. The mansion was no longer just a place of memory. It was a fortress, a sanctuary built not of stone alone, but of foresight and loyalty. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the dining hall, casting golden patterns across the polished oak table. I woke to the faint smell of coffee, drifting through the corridors, and the steady hum of quiet activity. When I stepped into the hall, Robert was already waiting with 2 men. One of them I recognized immediately. Michael Turner rose from his chair, his briefcase beside him, his expression calm but resolute. "Good morning, Hannah. Your grandfather trusted me with more than his will. He asked me to make sure you were never left unguarded." Before I could respond, the second man turned. His frame was solid. His uniform marked him clearly as a senior officer. "Colonel Mark Sullivan." He extended a hand, his grip firm, his gaze steady. "I served with your grandfather in Vietnam. He was a good man, the kind who understood loyalty. He told me once that you would need a shield one day, and that if I was still alive, I should stand with you." The weight of his words pressed into me. I felt the tremor in my hands ease as I nodded, trying to find the right response. "Thank you, sir." He shook his head. "No thanks needed. You are a soldier, and this is what soldiers do." He glanced toward Michael, then back at me. "Understand this, Hannah. If they come after you here, it is not just family business anymore. You are active duty. If they put a hand on you again, it is not only assault. It is a crime against the uniform, and the uniform will answer." My breath caught. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt a wall rising around me, not of stone, but of protection. Michael spread documents across the table, contracts and letters bearing my grandfather's signature, each one carefully preserved. Robert moved quietly around the room, checking locks, adjusting curtains. His presence as constant as the air. The colonel remained by the window, arms folded, his stance like a sentinel. I looked at the 3 of them and realized my family might have thrown me out, but I was not alone. My grandfather's foresight had built more than wealth. He had built alliances, people of integrity who now stood beside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. The mansion was not just a house anymore. It was a command post, a place where I could fight back with dignity. Later that afternoon, Robert asked me to follow him into the study. He carried a small locked box, its metal sides scratched but sturdy, and placed it gently on the desk. Your grandfather left this with me. He said, his voice low but steady. He told me to open it only when you were ready to understand how far your father and Dylan might go. My fingers trembled as I slid the key into the lock and lifted the lid. Inside lay a USB drive, a stack of photographs, and a thin journal bound in leather. Robert explained that days after the funeral, while I was still reeling from the loss Richard and Dylan had come to the mansion, they did not come to mourn. The security cameras captured them rifling through drawers, stuffing jewelry and documents into bags. The photographs showed them slipping into the study, their expressions twisted with greed, their hands full of things that did not belong to them. I pressed my hand to my mouth as anger surged through me. Michael leaned over the desk and examined the evidence, his face grave. "This is not just theft. This is burglary felony level," he said. "With this, the court will see them for what they are." He held up the journal and explained that it belonged to my grandmother, who had recorded every visit, every request for money, every kindness I had given. The pages told the story in her elegant handwriting. Richard demanded money again. Hannah arrived later with soup and stayed until Harold's fever broke. Each line was both a knife and a balm, cutting me with the truth of their cruelty, but healing me with proof that my grandfather had seen the difference. The USB drive contained the most damning piece. Robert slid it into the laptop, and the screen flickered to life, showing footage of my father and Dylan tearing through the mansion, their voices audible as they argued over which documents to take. Dylan's words cut like acid. "With this proof, the company will be mine." Richard's voice answered bitter and determined. "Hannah will never know." My hands curled into fists as I watched. They had spoken those words inside these walls, certain no one would ever hear. But my grandfather had been ready. He had fortified this house not only with marble and locks, but with cameras and witnesses. Michael closed the laptop with a decisive click, his eyes meeting mine. "This is more than enough to hold in court. But it is not just about legal battles, Hannah. It is about preparing for the moment they try again, because they will." His certainty chilled me, but it also steadied me. Colonel Sullivan stepped closer, his presence filling the room. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had lived through more storms than I could imagine. "If they lay a hand on you again, it is not only a family dispute. You are an active duty soldier. That makes it a crime against the United States Army. The military police will not stand aside if you are attacked." His words lit a spark inside me. For weeks, I had felt cornered, stripped of choices, but now I realized my uniform was more than fabric. It was a shield backed by law and duty. Robert poured fresh coffee and placed the cup gently by my side, his steady hand reminding me I was not alone. Michael spread the documents across the table, pointing to each one as he explained the plan. The photographs would demonstrate theft. The journal would establish a pattern of greed and neglect. The video would provide undeniable proof of burglary. Combined, they painted a picture that no judge could ignore. Colonel Sullivan added his own piece. "I have contacts at Fort Hood who can ensure military police are aware of the situation. If Richard or Dylan come here again, they will not walk away freely." He looked directly at me. "You will not have to fight this alone." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to speak. "They will not stop. They cannot stand the thought of losing." Michael nodded. "That is why we prepare. We will not simply defend. We will expose them." We sat there for hours, voices low but firm, building a strategy step by step. The fire crackled in the hearth, papers rustled beneath our hands, and the mansion seemed to breathe with us. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something deeper than fear. I felt resolve. My family thought they had broken me, but they had only sharpened me. My grandfather had always told me integrity was worth more than gold. Now I understood. Integrity would be the weapon I carried into this battle. It happened in the middle of the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the air quiet except for the distant ticking of the clock in the hall. I had just finished reviewing documents with Michael when the sound of tires crunching over gravel shattered the calm. My stomach dropped. Robert moved quickly to the window, his face tightening. "They are here!" Before I could react, the front doors burst open, the heavy slam echoing through the foyer like a gunshot. My father stormed in first, his face flushed with fury. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the veins stand out on his neck. Diane followed her eyes sharp, her voice already shrill with accusations. Dylan came last, his stride cocky, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with greed. "This is still our house," my father shouted. "You have no right to lock us out." I stood at the far end of the hall, my knees trembling, though I forced my back straight. "My grandfather gave this to me. Legally, morally, every way that matters." Dylan sneered and moved closer, his voice dripping with venom. "Do not play innocent. Everyone knows you manipulated him. A broke soldier suddenly inheriting billions. Who would believe that?" Michael stepped forward, holding a folder of documents high. Henry Walker left written and video statements. This inheritance was intentional and deliberate. "Contesting it will fail." My father snatched at the folder and flung it aside, pages scattering across the floor. His voice shook with rage. "This is garbage. None of it changes the truth. The fortune belongs to me by right." He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw not just anger in his eyes, but something darker, something violent. Dylan moved faster. He lunged forward, his boot slamming into my stomach with such force that the breath left my lungs in a rush. I gasped, collapsing to the marble floor, pain exploding through me like fire. I tasted blood in my mouth as I struggled to pull in air. Dylan leaned over me, his face twisted with triumph. "Sign it or choke." His voice cut through the haze of agony, each word laced with contempt. My father loomed behind him, his hands clenched into fists, shouting above the chaos. "You are nothing without us. Nothing." Diane's voice shrieked from the corner, a high-pitched wail that blended with the pounding in my ears. "You ungrateful child! After everything we gave you, this is how you repay us." My vision blurred, the chandelier above splintering into fragments of light. I tried to rise, pressing my palms against the cold marble, but Dylan shoved me down again, his boot pressing hard into my ribs. My chest burned, my body screaming for air. Somewhere in the haze, I remembered Fort Hood, the mornings of running until my lungs felt ready to burst, the drills that pushed me past exhaustion, the voices of sergeants demanding I find strength where none remained. Focus, breathe, endure. I clung to those memories as I gasped beneath the crushing weight of betrayal. The pain was real, the humiliation deeper, but I refused to let them see me broken. I forced my eyes open, blood pooling at the corner of my mouth, and whispered the only word I had left. "No." The sound of my refusal seemed to ripple through the room, a word so small yet heavy enough to ignite another explosion of fury. My father's face twisted, veins bulging along his temples as he leaned closer, his spit flying with every word. "You dare defy me after everything I built. You will regret this." Diane screamed from behind him, her pearls shaking with the violence of her movements. "She is throwing this family away. 7 billion belongs to us, not to some naive girl playing soldier." Dylan pressed his boot harder into my side, grinding against my ribs until white, hot pain surged through me. I bit down on a cry, refusing to give him the satisfaction. His voice dripped with venom as he snarled. "Crawl, Hannah! Admit you are nothing." The marble floor was cold against my palms, the chandelier light blinding above, but somewhere deep inside, a stubborn fire kept burning. I pushed against the weight, my arms trembling, my breath shallow. I would not surrender. Michael shouted, then his voice raw. "Enough!" He tried to step forward, but my father shoved him back, snarling. "Stay out of this. You work for me now." Papers fluttered across the floor like fallen leaves, evidence scattered under their shoes. Robert appeared at the doorway, his face pale, but his voice firm. "You are trespassing. Leave now before you destroy yourselves completely." My father turned on him, his eyes blazing. "You have served your purpose. Get out of my way." Dylan shifted his boot, pressing down again, his smile sharp and cruel. "You cannot hide behind Grandpa anymore. He is gone. It is just Us now. I felt the sting of tears, but forced myself to hold his gaze, blood on my lips, my chest heaving. My voice came out ragged but steady. He is not gone. He is here, in every word he left, in every choice he made, and you cannot erase that. Dylan raised his hand as if to strike me again, but in that instant, something shifted inside me. I rolled sharply to the side, his boot slamming into the marble instead of my body. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline carried me forward. I scrambled to my knees, my hand gripping the edge of the table for support. My father lunged his fist, swinging, but Robert stepped between us, blocking the blow with a courage that surprised me. "Get back!" he barked. His voice was trembling but unwavering. Diane shrieked louder, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You will lose everything, Hannah. You will end up with nothing but scars." I drew myself up as tall as I could, despite the pain my hand pressed against my ribs, my breath ragged but defiant. "Maybe scars are better than selling my soul." My words rang out across the hall, louder than I expected, carrying the truth I had held inside for years. For a heartbeat, silence followed their fury, clashing with my resolve, the room balanced on the edge of collapse. I stood there trembling, broken but unbowed, knowing the storm had not ended. It was only gathering strength. The tension in the mansion hung like a storm cloud ready to burst when the pounding of fists rattled the front doors. The sound was sharp and commanding, not the desperate banging of my father's rage, but the steady hammer of authority. Everyone froze. My father's face went pale for an instant before twisting again with fury. "Do not answer it," he barked. "This is our house." But Robert had already moved his steps quick and sure. He pulled the heavy doors wide and the world outside flooded in. Colonel Mark Sullivan stood framed against the gray afternoon light. His uniform pressed his presence, towering even without a word. Behind him stepped two military police officers in crisp fatigues, their expressions hard, their hands resting firmly on their belts. And just beyond them, three Houston Police Department officers entered their badges, catching the light, their radios crackling softly. The entire room seemed to shift as the weight of law and military authority filled the hall. My father's bluster faltered, but he recovered quickly, his voice rising in defiance. "This is a family matter. You have no right to interfere." Colonel Sullivan's gaze locked on him, calm but unyielding. "You are mistaken, Richard. This is not just family. You assaulted an active-duty soldier in her own residence. That is not a private matter. That is a crime." The words cut through the air, each syllable like steel. My father sputtered, turning toward the Houston officers. "She is my daughter. I can handle her." The lead officer stepped forward, his tone clipped and professional. "Not anymore. You put your hands on her, you forced entry into a residence that does not belong to you. That is assault and burglary." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, the ink still fresh. "We have a warrant issued this morning. You are under arrest." Dylan lurched forward, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous. She provoked us. She is lying." But one of the military police stepped closer, his voice low and even. "We have security footage. We saw you strike her. The evidence is clear." Dylan's bravado faltered for a flicker of a second, his eyes darting to the USB still lying on the table where Michael had placed it earlier. My father tried again, his words sharp and frantic. "You cannot do this. This is Walker property. I am his son." But Colonel Sullivan stepped forward until he stood inches away, his voice dropping into a tone that carried the full weight of command. "Your father's will made it clear. This estate belongs to Specialist Hannah Walker. Your trespass here is criminal, and your assault on her is an attack on the uniform she wears. You dishonor not only your family, but your country." The room went still, every word reverberating like the crack of a rifle. My chest ached, my ribs screaming from Dylan's kick, but for the first time I felt a surge of strength rising inside me. I was not alone anymore. The law was here. The army was here. Justice had finally walked through those doors. The moment stretched as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. My father stood rigid, his fists clenched, his chest heaving, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "This is madness. You cannot put me in chains." Dylan's voice rose in a high pitch that sounded more like panic than fury. "We are family. She owes us. She cannot stand against us." But the Houston officer had already stepped forward with a pair of steel cuffs in his hand. "Richard Carter, you are under arrest for felony assault and burglary. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Dylan tried to back away, but one of the military police cut him off his boots, striking the marble with steady thuds. "Dylan Carter, you are also under arrest." The officer's voice was flat, uncompromising. "You assaulted an active duty soldier. That alone guarantees you will face federal scrutiny." Dylan spun around, eyes wild, looking for someone to defend him, but even Diane shrank back, her hands trembling as she clutched her pearls. No one stepped forward to shield him. The MP grabbed his wrist and snapped the cuffs shut with a finality that echoed louder than his protests. My father fought harder. He shoved once, then twice, but the Houston officers were ready. They forced his arms behind him, their grip unyielding, their voices calm but firm. "Stop resisting. You will only make this worse." The sight of Richard Carter, the man who had once towered over me with nothing but contempt, being forced down until his knees hit the marble, struck me like lightning. For the first time, I saw him not as an immovable figure of authority, but as what he truly was, a man undone by greed, exposed before the law. Colonel Sullivan moved closer, his presence dominating the room, his eyes steady on the scene. He spoke not with anger, but with the calm gravity of someone who had seen worse and lived to tell it. "You thought you could use fear to break her. You thought blood made you untouchable. But when you laid a hand on a soldier, you crossed a line you can never uncross." His words carried the weight of both military honor and personal truth, and every syllable burned into the silence. Dylan thrashed once more, shouting at me, spitting curses, but the MP dragged him back. His hands bound his voice, already fading into nothing but echoes. My father's defiance collapsed into bitter silence as the cuffs tightened. The Houston officers lifted him to his feet, his head lowered now, his power gone. Diane sobbed into her hands, calling after them, but no one answered. The law had already claimed them. I stood against the wall, my body aching, my ribs bruised, blood still drying on my lip. The chaos was leaving with them, pulled out the door in a flurry of boots and radios, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost holy. Colonel Sullivan turned to me, then his eyes softer, his voice quieter but still carved from stone. "Specialist Walker, you stood your ground. You endured when many would have broken. Your grandfather would be proud." Something inside me broke then, not with despair but with release. I had held my breath for so long, waiting for the next blow, the next demand, the next betrayal. And now, as the heavy doors closed behind the officers leading my father and Dylan away in chains, I let out a sob that shook my whole body. Robert was at my side, instantly steadying me, his hand firm on my shoulder. Michael bent down to pick up the scattered pages of the will, his movements careful as if rebuilding what had been torn apart. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence with warmth. Colonel Sullivan gave me one final nod, his words lingering like a benediction. "This is your home now. Protect it with the same dignity you showed today." I lowered my head, my tears falling hot onto the marble floor, but my voice was steady as I whispered the only promise that mattered. "I will." The weeks that followed moved in a blur of hearings, testimonies, and headlines that seemed to carry my family's disgrace across every paper in Texas. I wore my uniform when I testified not as a show of pride, but as a shield, reminding myself that I was more than their victim. The courtroom was packed the day Richard and Dylan faced the charges: burglary, assault, trespassing, attempted coercion. Their lawyers tried to spin the story, painting me as an ungrateful daughter blinded by sudden wealth, but the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage played across the screen for the entire court to see. My father's hand ripping drawers open, Dylan's boot striking my ribs, my body collapsing against the marble. The gasps in the room echoed through me like vindication. No one could deny the truth any more. Diane sat in the back, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but every so often I caught the tremor of her hand as she dabbed at her eyes. Her world of social luncheons and country club smiles was crumbling alongside her husband's reputation. The judge's words came down like iron. Richard Carter guilty on all counts. Dylan Carter guilty on all counts. Sentencing will proceed immediately. I sat rigid as the sentences were read. Years in prison, heavy fines, court orders banning them from approaching me or the estate. For so long I had feared them as untouchable figures who controlled my every move. Watching them led away in shackles, I realized the truth. They were never giants. They were just men who mistook fear for power, and now both had been stripped away. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, but I kept walking, the Texas sun glaring down on me. I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a quiet relief that justice had not bent under their wealth or their threats. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt the air clear around me. The chain that had bound me to their cruelty had finally broken. 3 months after the trial, I stood on a stage in downtown Houston, a banner fluttering behind me with bold letters that read, "The Walker Veterans Foundation." The air was warm, the kind of humid Texas heat that clung to every breath, but I barely felt it. My palms were damp as I gripped the podium, looking out at the crowd of veterans, families, students, and community members who had gathered for the launch. Cameras flashed, but it was not the press I cared about. It was the rows of men and women in faded uniforms, their faces lined with stories that most of the world never bothered to ask about. My voice shook at first, but then steadied. This foundation is not just about money. It is about service. My grandfather believed in integrity above all else, and he believed that those who serve deserve opportunities when they come home. We are dedicating $2 billion to scholarships, housing assistance, and community programs for veterans and their families. The applause that followed rolled like thunder, and I let it wash over me. I thought back to the girl I had been just months before, standing in my parents' house with nothing but a duffel bag and a brass key, unsure if I could survive another day. Now I was building something that could outlast me. After the speeches, I walked among the crowd. A woman in her 40s gripped my hand tightly, her eyes wet. My husband came back from deployment and struggled for years. "What you are doing will save lives." A young soldier still in uniform saluted me, and for the first time I returned the gesture not out of duty, but out of pride. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, I sat alone in the mansion's study with Robert and Michael nearby. Rosa had left charts and reports on the desk, already planning the next steps for the foundation. Dorothy had baked a pie for the staff who stayed late. It felt less like a mansion and more like a living, breathing home. I realized then that wealth had not changed me. What had changed me was the choice to use it with purpose. My scars still ached on bad nights, and sometimes the echoes of Dylan's voice still haunted me, but they no longer defined me. What defined me now was the work, the people, the future I was building out of ashes. One crisp autumn morning, I drove alone to Houston Memorial Cemetery, the same place where grief had nearly broken me months earlier. The air was cool and dry, the leaves crunching under my boots as I carried a bouquet of white lilies, my grandfather's favorite. The city buzzed beyond the gates, but here the silence was gentle, almost protective. I found his grave under the oak tree, the marble headstone carved with simple words, "Harold Walker, a legacy of integrity." I knelt down, brushing fallen leaves from the base, and placed the flowers carefully. For a long time, I just sat there staring at his name, letting the stillness wrap around me. My chest tightened, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "Hi, Grandpa. I hope you can see me. I hope you are proud." My voice cracked, and I pressed a hand against the cool stone. I told him about the trial, about the foundation, about the people who were already finding hope through his legacy. I told him about Robert's steady presence, Michael's guidance, Rosa's sharp mind, Dorothy's warmth. I told him that the mansion was no longer a fortress of fear, but a home of laughter and purpose. Tears blurred my vision, but I smiled through them. I finally understand. It was never about the billions. It was about what I would do when the weight of that responsibility was placed in my hands. "You trusted me, and I will not fail you." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, then scattering the golden leaves, lifting my hair from my shoulders. For a moment, it felt like an answer, a quiet affirmation carried through the air. I rose to my feet, standing straight, shoulders squared, the way I had been taught in uniform. I gave him one final salute, my hand steady at my brow. Then I whispered the vow that had been building inside me since the day everything changed. Your legacy is not money. It is integrity, and I will carry it forward. I turned and walked back toward the gates, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, lighting the path ahead. For the first time, I did not feel like I was leaving him behind. I felt like I was carrying him with me step by step into the life he had believed I could build.